When people think of Nazi Germany's leadership, they often picture cold, calculating monsters. But Hermann Göring was different. He was flamboyant and vain, and he lived like a king while millions suffered. So what did Hitler's second-in-command actually do all day? Did he spend his time planning military operations and running the state? Or was he too busy collecting stolen art, changing uniforms, and feeding his massive drug addiction? Let's step into the bizarre, excessive world of one of history's most peculiar villains. Hermann Göring did not wake up early. Unlike the disciplined military officers around him, Göring loved luxury and comfort. He usually slept until 10 or 11 in the morning, sometimes even later. His bedroom at Karrenhall, his massive estate north of Berlin, was decorated like a palace. Silk sheets, ornate furniture, paintings worth millions covering the walls. Everything was excessive. Everything was for show. When he finally woke up, his morning routine was elaborate. Servants would bring him breakfast in bed. Not a simple meal, but a feast. Eggs, sausages, pastries, multiple kinds of bread, jams, cheeses, and fruit. Göring was enormously overweight, especially in the later years of the war, and his appetite was legendary. He would eat for an hour, sometimes longer, while reading reports or newspapers. But here is something most people do not know. Göring was a drug addict. He had been hooked on morphine since the 1920s after being wounded during Hitler's failed beer hall putsch. Every morning, often multiple times throughout the day, he would inject himself with morphine or take pills containing various opiates. This addiction affected everything he did. It clouded his judgment. It made him erratic and contributed to his eventual downfall. His staff knew about it. Hitler knew about it. But Göring was too powerful, too close to the Führer, for anyone to do anything about it. After breakfast and his morning dose of drugs, Göring would spend an absurd amount of time choosing what to wear. This was not a simple matter of putting on a uniform. Göring had designed dozens of elaborate uniforms for himself, each more ridiculous than the last. White uniforms with gold braid, sky blue uniforms with medals covering every inch, and hunting outfits that looked like they belonged in a costume drama. He loved clothes the way some people love cars or jewelry. He would stand in front of mirrors, posing, adjusting his medals, making sure everything looked perfect. He wore makeup, he painted his nails, he used perfume. For a man who claimed to embody German military strength, he was remarkably concerned with his appearance in ways that his fellow Nazis would have considered unmanly. But no one dared mock him to his face. He was still Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, president of the Reichstag, and Hitler's designated successor. By noon, Göring might finally make his way to his office, though the word office is a generous description of what he actually did there. Unlike other Nazi leaders who were involved in detailed administrative work, Göring preferred grand gestures and big-picture thinking. He did not like paperwork. He did not like complicated details. He wanted to make dramatic decisions and then let other people handle the boring parts. As head of the Luftwaffe, Germany's Air Force, Göring was responsible for one of the most powerful military branches in the world. But he was a terrible administrator. He made promises he could not keep, approved unrealistic production goals, and ignored warnings from his own generals when they contradicted what he wanted to hear. When the Luftwaffe began to fail, especially during the Battle of Britain, and later when Allied bombers started destroying German cities, Göring blamed everyone but himself. He accused his pilots of cowardice, his engineers of incompetence, his intelligence officers of lying. He could not accept that his leadership was part of the problem. What Göring really loved was acquiring things: art, jewels, property, anything valuable. He used his position to. Göring looted art collections from across occupied Europe, especially from Jewish families who had been murdered or driven into exile. His agents confiscated paintings, sculptures, rare books, and furniture, sending the best pieces to Karrenhall and his other properties. He accumulated one of the largest private art collections in Europe, worth hundreds of millions even by 1940s standards. Renaissance prints. His afternoons were often spent examining his latest acquisitions. He had art dealers and experts brought to him, showing off his treasures and boasting about his taste and knowledge. He saw himself as a Renaissance prince, a cultured man who appreciated beauty. The fact that most of this art was stolen from people who had been murdered did not seem to bother him at all. In his mind, he was rescuing these masterpieces and giving them a proper home. Hunting. Goring also loved hunting. He owned vast hunting estates and spent many afternoons shooting deer, boar, and other game. He dressed in elaborate hunting costumes, some of which he designed himself. These outfits were so theatrical that even other Nazis found them embarrassing. But Göring did not care. He wanted to look like a medieval nobleman, and he had the power to make that fantasy real. Lunch was another enormous meal, often lasting 2 hours or more. Göring would invite guests to dine with him, holding court like a king. He was a good storyteller and could be charming when he wanted to be. He would tell jokes, share war stories from World War I when he had been a flying ace, and gossip about other Nazi leaders. He loved being the center of attention. But beneath the charm was something monstrous. Göring was directly responsible for some of the worst crimes of the Nazi regime. He was one of the primary architects of the Holocaust. In 1941, he signed the order authorizing the final solution: the systematic murder of European Jews. He knew exactly what was happening in the concentration camps and death camps. He approved the logistics, the resources, the personnel needed to carry out genocide on an industrial scale. He was also responsible for the creation of the Gestapo, the secret police that terrorized Germany and occupied territories. He established the first concentration camps, beginning with Dachau in 1933. He oversaw the brutal suppression of any opposition to Nazi rule. People disappeared in the night, were tortured in basements, and were sent to camps where they died by the thousands. Yet Göring compartmentalized all of this horror. In his mind, he was simply doing what was necessary for Germany's greatness. He would spend his afternoons admiring stolen paintings, and then casually sign orders that would result in thousands of deaths. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. By evening, Göring was usually at his estate or at one of his many properties. Dinner was yet another lavish affair, multiple courses, the finest wines, servants attending to every need. He would often host parties, inviting foreign diplomats, artists, and even some of the aristocrats who had survived the Nazi rise to power. These gatherings were surreal. Champagne flowing, an orchestra playing, people dancing. While outside the estate, Germany was at war and people were dying. Göring loved showing off during these parties. He would give tours of his art collection, tell stories about his adventures, and bask in the admiration of his guests. He wanted to be loved, to be seen as sophisticated and powerful. He needed constant validation, constant attention. As the war turned against Germany, Göring's lifestyle became increasingly disconnected from reality, while German cities were being bombed to rubble. While soldiers were dying by the hundreds of thousands on the Eastern Front, Göring continued to live in luxury. He gained even more weight, became more dependent on drugs, and made increasingly poor decisions. His relationship with Hitler deteriorated. Hitler began to see Göring as weak, a failure who had let the Luftwaffe collapse. By 1943 and 1944, Göring was largely sidelined. He spent more time at his estates and less time in Berlin. He focused on his art collection, on hunting, on anything that would let him escape the reality that Germany was losing the war. In the final days of the war, Göring made a fatal miscalculation. When Hitler was trapped in his bunker in Berlin, Göring sent a telegram suggesting that he take over leadership of Germany since Hitler was cut off. Hitler saw this as betrayal and stripped Göring of all his positions. It was a humiliating end to decades of loyalty and service. After the war, Göring was captured by American forces. At the Nuremberg trials, he was the highest-ranking Nazi to stand trial. Unlike many of his co-defendants who appeared broken or who tried to deny their actions, Göring remained defiant. He was charming, articulate, and utterly unrepentant. He defended the Nazi regime, argued with prosecutors, and tried to portray himself as a soldier who had simply followed orders and loved his country. He was convicted on all counts: crimes against peace, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and conspiracy to commit these crimes. He was sentenced to death by hanging. But Göring had one final act of defiance. The night before his execution, he swallowed a cyanide capsule that he had somehow hidden from his guards. He denied the Allies the satisfaction of executing him. Even in death, he needed to be in control. So what did Hermann Göring actually do all day? He slept late, took drugs, changed into absurd uniforms, and stole art from murdered families. He hosted lavish parties while signing orders for mass murder. He lived in a fantasy world of luxury and power, disconnected from the suffering he helped create. He was vain, greedy, and monstrously evil, hiding behind a veneer of culture and sophistication. Behind the medals and the paintings was a man who enabled genocide, who built the machinery of terror, and who never once showed genuine remorse for any of it. A cautionary tale about how power, vanity, and moral bankruptcy can combine to create something truly horrible. What do you think made Göring so different from other Nazi leaders? Was it his vanity, his addiction, or something deeper? Let us know in the comments. Most people remember the big names of Nazi Germany: Hitler, Himmler, Goebbels. But there's one man who quietly commanded the seas, unleashed terror across the Atlantic, and eventually became Hitler's chosen successor. His name was Karl Donitz. What did the man who led Germany's deadly submarine fleet actually do each day? Was he truly just a military professional? Or was he something far more sinister? Let's dive beneath the surface and discover the daily life of the man who ruled the U-boats. Karl Donitz was a creature of routine and discipline. Unlike many Nazi leaders who lived in luxury and excess, Donitz saw himself as a true naval officer, a man of the sea. His morning started early, usually around 6 a.m. He believed in military precision, and his day reflected that rigid structure. The first thing he did each morning was exercise. Nothing elaborate, just basic calisthenics and stretching. He wanted to stay fit and sharp, even as he aged. Physical weakness was something he despised. After his brief workout, Donitz would wash, dress in his crisp naval uniform, and sit down for a simple breakfast, usually black coffee, bread, butter, and perhaps some cheese or cold cuts. He ate quickly and efficiently. Food was fuel, nothing more. He had no time for the long, indulgent meals that Hitler enjoyed. Donitz was already thinking about the war, about his submarines, about the ships they would hunt that day. By 7:30 a.m., Donitz was at his desk. Whether he was at his headquarters in occupied France, later in Berlin, or aboard his command ship, the routine never changed. The first order of business was always the same: reports. Dozens of them. Throughout the night, his U-boats had been prowling the Atlantic Ocean, hunting Allied convoys that carried supplies, troops, and weapons from America to Britain. Each submarine commander sent back coded messages about their positions, their targets, and their kills. Donitz read every single report personally. He didn't delegate this task. He wanted to know exactly where each of his submarines was, what they were doing, and how successful they were. He studied maps covered with tiny markers representing his wolf packs, groups of U-boats that hunted together like predators stalking prey. He would move the markers around, calculating distances, plotting intercept courses, deciding which submarines should attack which convoys. This wasn't just military strategy. This was economic warfare designed to starve Britain into submission. Donitz's U-boats didn't just sink warships. They sank cargo ships, oil tankers, and supply vessels. They sent thousands of merchant sailors to the bottom of the ocean. Many of these men died slow, horrible deaths, freezing in the water or drowning as their ships went down. Donitz knew this. He understood the human cost. And he didn't care. To him, it was simply war. What most people don't know is how personally involved Donitz, D-U-H-Nitz, was in the U-boat war. He wasn't some distant commander giving vague orders. He knew many of his submarine captains by name. He read their reports, praised their successes, and mourned their losses. When a U-boat failed to return, which happened more and more as the war went on, Donitz would mark it as lost and move on. But privately, these losses ate at him. He saw his submariners as his sons, his boys, yet he kept sending them out, knowing that fewer and fewer would come back. By mid-morning, Donitz would hold meetings with his staff officers. These sessions could last for hours. They discussed tactics, new technologies, and intelligence reports about Allied defenses. Donitz was obsessed with improving his U-boats. He pushed for faster submarines, better torpedoes, and new ways to evade enemy detection. He was a technical innovator, always looking for an edge. One of his most significant contributions was the development of the wolf pack tactic. Instead of having submarines hunt alone, Donitz coordinated groups of U-boats to attack convoys simultaneously from multiple directions. This overwhelmed the convoy escorts and led to devastating losses for Allied shipping. He would spend hours at his plotting table orchestrating these attacks like a conductor leading an orchestra of death. He tracked weather patterns, moon phases, and convoy schedules with meticulous detail. Donitz also personally reviewed every aspect of U-boat design and crew training. He visited shipyards to inspect new submarines under construction, demanding modifications based on feedback from his captains. He established rigorous training programs for submarine crews, knowing that even the best technology was useless without skilled operators. He created specialized schools where men learned to operate in the claustrophobic, dangerous environment of a submarine. These vessels were essentially steel coffins. They were cramped, smelly, and terrifying. One depth charge could crush the hull and kill everyone inside instantly. Yet Donitz demanded absolute perfection from his crews. But here's where things get darker. Donitz was not just a military professional doing his duty. He was a committed Nazi. He believed in Hitler's vision for Germany and supported the regime fully. In speeches to his men, he often spoke about loyalty to the Führer, about fighting for the survival of the German race, and about the need for total commitment to National Socialism. He wasn't forced to say these things. He meant them. Donitz also knew about and supported the Holocaust. While he didn't personally operate concentration camps, he was fully aware of what was happening. He never spoke out against it. He never questioned it. In fact, he actively worked to remove Jewish sailors and personnel from the Navy. He issued orders that aligned with Nazi racial policies and enforced them without hesitation. This wasn't a man who was just following orders. He was a true believer. Lunch was usually around noon, and like breakfast, it was quick and functional. Donitz might eat at his desk while continuing to work, or he would join his senior officers in a small dining room. The meals were simple, typically German military fare: potatoes, vegetables, meat, bread. He didn't drink alcohol during the day. He needed to stay focused. His mind was always on the war, always on the next operation. In the afternoons, Donitz often traveled. He visited submarine bases along the French coast, places like Lorient, Brest, and Saint-Nazaire. These bases were heavily fortified with massive concrete bunkers that protected the U-boats from Allied bombing raids. When Donitz arrived, it was a major event. He would inspect the submarines, talk to the crews, and give speeches. His speeches were powerful. He spoke with conviction and passion. He told his young submariners that they were Germany's elite warriors, that the fate of the nation rested on their shoulders. He praised their courage and sacrifice. He told them they were fighting for their families, for their homeland, for their future. And then he sent them out to die. Many of the men who served under Donitz genuinely loved him. He had a talent for making each sailor feel important, for remembering names and details about their lives. When a crew returned from a successful patrol, Donitz would often be there personally to greet them. shaking hands, handing out medals, posing for photographs. He cultivated this image of the caring commander who valued his men, but it was a calculated performance. He needed these young men to trust him completely, to follow his orders without question, even when those orders meant sailing into almost certain death. The psychological toll on U-boat crews was immense. They spent weeks at a time submerged in darkness, breathing recycled air, never knowing if the next moment would bring a depth charge that would crush them. They couldn't shower, they couldn't escape the constant noise of the engines and the creaking of the hull. Some men broke down completely. Others became numb to the horror. Donitz was aware of all this, but he saw it as the price of victory. He believed that German willpower and discipline could overcome any obstacle, even mathematics and technology that proved the U-boat campaign was becoming unsustainable. Because that's what was happening by 1943 and 1944. The Allies had cracked the German naval codes. They knew where the U-boats were. They had developed better sonar, faster escort ships, and long-range aircraft that could hunt submarines from the air. The Atlantic was becoming a graveyard for German submariners. Out of roughly 40,000 men who served in the U-boat force during World War II, about 30,000 died. That's a 75% death rate, the highest of any military branch in the entire war. Donitz knew the odds. He saw the casualty reports every single day, but he kept sending them out. When his own sons served on U-boats, and one of them was killed in action, Donitz grieved privately but publicly called it an honor. He used his son's death as propaganda, as proof of his own commitment to the cause. By evening, Donitz would return to his quarters. He lived modestly compared to other Nazi leaders. No grand palaces or lavish estates, just functional military housing. He would have dinner, again something simple, and then spend the late evening reading reports, writing orders, and planning the next day's operations. He also spent time writing in his diary and composing reports for Hitler. Donitz had a complicated relationship with the Führer. He respected Hitler's authority but often disagreed with his decisions about naval strategy. Unlike some Nazi leaders who feared Hitler, Donitz could speak relatively frankly. Hitler respected him because Donitz delivered results and because he was loyal without being a sycophant. This loyalty would ultimately lead to one of history's strangest moments. In April 1945, as the Nazi regime collapsed and Hitler prepared to die in his bunker, he chose Karl Donitz to succeed him as the leader of Germany. Not Goebbels, not Himmler, not Göring, Donitz. A naval officer became the last Führer of Nazi Germany. For 23 days, Donitz led what remained of the Third Reich. He operated from northern Germany, trying to negotiate surrender terms and maintain some form of government. But it was all futile. Germany was defeated. The war was over. On May 23, 1945, British forces arrested Donitz and his government. Unlike many top Nazis who committed suicide or went into hiding, Donitz faced trial at Nuremberg. He was convicted of war crimes and crimes against peace. He served 10 years in Spandau prison. Throughout his imprisonment and for the rest of his life, Donitz never truly accepted responsibility. He maintained that he was simply a naval officer doing his duty. He denied being a committed Nazi despite all evidence to the contrary. He expressed no real remorse for the deaths he caused or the regime he served. After his release in 1956, Donitz lived quietly in northern Germany until his death in 1980. He wrote memoirs that portrayed himself as a professional sailor caught up in events beyond his control. Many former submariners remained loyal to him, seeing him as a father figure who had cared about his men. But the historical record tells a different story. Even decades after the war, Donitz attended reunions of former U-boat crews. Old men who had served under him still called him Grand Admiral and treated him with reverence. He signed autographs, posed for pictures, and basked in their admiration. He never apologized for the war crimes committed under his command. He never acknowledged the moral bankruptcy of the cause he had served. Instead, he spoke about duty, honor, and military professionalism, as if these concepts existed in a vacuum, separate from the evil regime he had loyally served. In private conversations recorded by historians and journalists, Donitz continued to defend Hitler's early policies and only criticized the Führer's later military decisions. He claimed he had known nothing about the Holocaust, despite mountains of evidence proving otherwise. He maintained this fiction until his death, refusing to confront the reality that he had been an integral part of one of history's most monstrous regimes. His funeral was attended by hundreds of former Navy personnel, some of whom gave the Nazi salute at his grave, a final testament to the ideology he had never truly abandoned. So what did Karl Donitz actually do all day? He woke early, studied his maps, and sent young men to their deaths in the cold Atlantic waters. He gave inspiring speeches while enforcing Nazi ideology. He innovated deadly tactics while supporting a genocidal regime. He was not just a military officer following orders. He was a true believer who knew exactly what he was fighting for and never looked back. What do you think? Can someone be a professional soldier while serving an evil cause, or does that make them equally guilty? Let us know in the comments below. And if you found this look into one of history's most overlooked figures interesting, please like this video and subscribe for more deep dives into the past. Thanks for watching.